All right, everyone, welcome. Week 3 of Old Testament 1. So today we're going to try to finish the book of Genesis. We just started Genesis last time, Genesis 1, and we have a lot to cover. And we're going to just pick some of the key events in the book of Genesis today. And my goal is to try to finish by end of this class, at least get close enough to finishing. But before we start, why don't we open with a time of prayer? Larry, why don't you?
Heavenly Father, we bow in thanks for the privilege of being here to study your word. We pray that you would bless Pradeep as he leads and teaches us, help us to have minds attentive, and that we might grow to know your word better, that we might know you better and serve you. We praise you and thank you. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so I'm just having a syllabus out first. So in your syllabus on your second page, you see that by week 3, we need to finish Genesis, and that's what my goal is today. But also, we have 2 other things. The first thing I want to talk about is the textbook summary. So I hope all of you have the textbook by now. And if you have it, let me go to the page number 3. On the top of page 3, you have the details for what the textbook summary should look like. So in case you're using Geisler, that's chapter 3 and chapter 10. And these are introductions to the book of law and history. And if you're using any other book, is anyone here using any other book besides Geisler? Okay, so in that case, those are the 2 chapters that you need to summarize. And the goal here is you want to summarize it, not just copy it. Try to use all the main outlines as much as you can. So that way, when you, like a couple of years from now, when you come back and look at this, you'll have a solid overview of these chapters. I think these are important chapters for us. So if you can plan on working on the summary, use these guidelines, if you will, in terms of how to write, I think that will help. Again, the page, number of pages, 1 to 5 pages is sufficient for me. And in terms of why you're doing this, this is actually just a reference for yourself in the future. So if you can plan on working on this, and in 2 weeks from now, it will be due. Does anyone have any questions on how to do the textbook summary? I think most of you have been in class before, so if you have any questions, you can ask me via email, or we can talk about it now.
Do we submit a hard copy, or do we submit?
Actually, either way is good. If it is online, you can just email it to me for now,
Okay.
and that should be fine. And but if you want to bring a hard copy, that's fine also. Okay, so and then going back to your to week 3 on page number 2, the quiz was one of those items that was there. I know that some of you had difficulty getting to the Moodle page, so I'm just going to quickly walk through this so that way, if you have any questions, you can. Well, assuming my web page browser comes up.
We're all set now.
Oh, is it okay?
I think we took the quiz. So.
Oh, so just difficult finding it.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll put a link or something on the.
We're going to do the quiz on Wednesday.
Okay. All right, so that's it from the syllabus. Now, there's one other thing with your syllabus that. So one other thing I want to talk about, and that is your map. So all of you have the map handouts, and as I said, there are several maps here. I want you to still go through them on a weekly basis so you get familiar with them. And then next week, we're going to be talking about the summary of one book of the Bible. So I hope you've already picked the book of the Bible or considering it. So if you, next week, you may want to come with the specific book that you want to write a summary on, whether it's Genesis or 1 Samuel or whichever book it is. And based on which book you have, I'll tell you which map would be the best one to go with. Some of them would be obvious, and for some books, maybe not so obvious. And next week, we'll talk about, along with your book of the Bible summary, how that assignment should be done. We'll also look at the map and how that needs to be done. All right, so that's pretty much it for assignments and homework. And with that, we can go back to our slides. So we are on the second, what is this called? It's on week 2 and slide number 11. And last week, if you remember, we looked at the 6 days of creation, and then we saw the 2 ways in which this was divided by the author. In verse 1, let's open up our Bibles to Genesis 1. And verse 2 says, the earth was without form and void, and this formation and the filling of this heavens and the earth is now given in detail in these 6 days. So you have the light on day 1, which is formed, and then you have the individual light bearers on day 4. Day 2, you have water and sky. And actually, Linda had a very good question. What does this mean? So you have the water vapor and what you call the canopy, the atmosphere that we have as opposed to the water that is on the earth itself. That is the division in day 2. And then on day 5, you have fish in the liquid water on the ground, and then you have birds in the atmosphere. And then you have the day 3, the breaking up of the dry land and the vegetation. So the water stops and the land is there, and then you have the land populated on day 6 with land animals and man. And then day 7, we saw the Sabbath rest and what that meant. Not that God needed to rest, but that his work of creation was complete. Now, from here on, I'm going to go through, in the next slide, Genesis 1, 26 to 27, I'm going to go through various events. Now, I personally may not have picked all these events that John Stevenson did. He actually picks the events that would be most, that would raise the most questions. And in my mind, these are not necessarily the most important ones. So some of those I'll go fast, and others, even though there may not be too much detail in the slides, we'll end up talking a little bit more. And also, he has a focus in terms of, what some of the liberal scholars will be talking about. So I'm going to allude to that, and then some things we may spend some time, and others we may not spend as much. All right, so with that, we're on the next slide, Genesis 1, 26 to 27. And here you have, God said, actually, can someone just read the verses on your screen?
God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. And let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them.
Thank you. So here you have in Genesis 1 itself the broader aspect of the creation of man. And here, as you can see in your PowerPoint, John kind of focuses on the words, the plural references to God. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Now the question is, what does plurality refer to here? Now linguistically, and this is basically what a bunch of the scholars go down, is there is a royal or divine, a plurality that is used to show the greatness or grandeur of something. So for example, if you go back to Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. Now when you talk about the heavens, it is so grand that it's always in the plural. You never see heaven. It's always in the plural, talking about it's extremely grand. And so there is, just from a etymological standpoint, that term could refer to the grandness of God, and then talk about him in the plurality, just he's a grand and great God. Now, in addition to that, obviously in the Old Testament, the concept of the Trinity is not explicitly veiled. You see some hints and allusions to it, but only when you come into the New Testament, you see how Jesus Christ is the second person of the Trinity, where the Holy Spirit was a person who is also God, and then you have God the Father, Son, and the Spirit. And could this be a reference to the triune nature of God? It's possible. Now, from just a purely textual standpoint, this could more likely point us to the grandeur and the greatness and the immensity of God. But for us now with the New Testament, we can more clearly see that there is a plurality in God himself, which we come to find out later. But I want to just take a few moments now to talk about the rest of this verse. Now let them rule or have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, every creeping thing. Basically, everything that God has made, God now wants man to rule over. And the second half of the verse, you see, God created man in his own image, and in the image of God, he created them, him, male and female, he created them. And the point there being that man is unique, very different than the rest of the creation, because man has the image of God, which is unlike any other creature that exists. And this image of God, okay, there's a few things. Let me quickly step through them. The first thing I want to point out is that create that is used here, the word for man, also uses the term bara, which is talking about creating out of nothing. Whereas you see the word for create being a word that is fashioning, and on the other hand, there is something that is creating ex nihilo. And the term that is used here is also the same word, bara, which is out of nothing. And when you look at the last verse there, male and female, he created them. So both man and women have the image of God in them. Because you're going to see in Genesis 2 that God creates woman out of the man, and it doesn't somehow mean women are second class. Men and women have the image of God in them. They are both image bearers and reflect God himself. And that's the idea of image, it is we reflect who God is. Now, one of the attributes of God that we want to talk about here is God owns the world that he has made, and he has dominion over it. And because man is created in his image, he now has the right or the rule over this land. And God has made man with that purpose, that he would indeed have dominion over the rest of creation. We're going to see a little bit more about this, but I just wanted to, since we have the verse here, we look at them in detail. And if you have questions, please bring them up, because we're going to keep moving in greater speed as we go through the class today.
So I have. So why does he write, God created man in his own image, in the image of God he created? What's the significance of writing the same sentence two times?
Excellent. And actually, you're going to see this a lot in the Old Testament. Because the Hebrew is it's very different than the Greek. The Greek is more of like an analytical, precise language. It just tries to say in very precise verbs what actually is being done. Whereas Hebrew is a more poetic. It's a Semitic language, and the way in which they would provide emphasis is normally by repetition. It's more like, think of it like poetry, the language itself. So you will have the same truth said in multiple ways, or there'll be other devices in the literature that help you emphasize certain things. So this is, in this particular case, it is just reiterating the same truth, but then it's not like you have sometimes you see synonyms just to convey the same truths, and sometimes maybe a little bit more detail, but that's not necessarily always the case. Good question. So on the next slide, Genesis 1:28. So God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over." Again, you have all the various creatures that God has made, and you can see the commands that are given to man: be fruitful and multiply. This is one of the responsibilities that is given to man, to fill the earth, to populate the earth, and to spread out and have dominion over all the earth. And we'll see in Genesis 11, this was one of the commands that man didn't want to obey. and subdue it, and to have responsibility over it and to rule over it. And the idea that we should get from here, actually, yeah, we have it here. So you see, one of the reason that man has this ability is he is made in the image of God and stewardship under God because he is made in God's image. But at the same time, he also has a federal headship. Normally, the federal headship that we think about, for example, in Romans 5, we think of how Adam is our head of all humanity, and that is true. And this responsibility comes to us through the original command given to Adam. So under Adam's sin, we'll see in a few minutes, we all fall, and under Christ Jesus's headship, we are all redeemed. But there is another aspect here as well when you talk about federal headship. It is that man is representing all of creation. And so when man falls, when man rules well, all of creation gets to benefit from it. And when man falls, he brings God's curse upon creation itself. And so you look again in Romans, you see how all the earth is groaning and waiting for the redemption, because it is also under the curse that comes upon man after the fall. And the last point here, stewardship and a basis for ecology. What is the basis by which we need to be responsible for the environment we live in? It is right here. God commands us. It belongs to God. This doesn't belong to us. And we are given responsibility to take care of it. Now, again, when we talk about the subject, you have today environmentalists who kind of go off on one end, and the problem they have is they would elevate, obviously, they see abuses of this beautiful place that God has given us, and they would elevate the rest of creation over the need for the responsibility we have for human beings. And I think, and sometimes Christians can kind of go the other extreme and say, you know what, I'm reacting to this. I say, I don't care, I'll do whatever I want. And I think neither of those are good responses. We need to honor God by the way in which we live here on earth and care for what God has provided. Any thoughts on this? Because there's a lot that can be said about this. Comments, questions?
So, the concept of this federal headship.
Yes.
How do we know that? So, where do we know that it's true? That the blessings of the federal headship will come down to creation, but because of the fall of man, the curses of that fall through as well.
We even actually see in Genesis 3 how the kind of fall breaks itself out, and because of man, why the ground is cursed, or because of him. But the thing is, that's a good question. I can probably get more details on that. I just have
My question is was Adam aware of the fact that he had this burden on himself?
I don't think it's applied as a burden. When this was given to him, you may want to think of yourself as a ruler. You are the king of this planet. God has given everything to you. Everything is good. There's no problem at this point. And we're going to see when the test is given, he could have, obviously chosen to obey God. But when he falls, everything goes with him. And I think I kind of see your question. At what point is this tying of his responsibility and the consequences to the rest of the world? Is it explicitly stated out here? Not that I can think of, but I think you see Adam and God walking in the garden, and I think while a lot of it is not recorded, I think from the scriptures we can see that there is a very close tying in, because both in this section, the first 3 chapters, you see how God wants man to be responsible for all of creation, and then in chapter 2 we'll see the garden. But then in Romans,
I was going to say it's explicit in Romans.
Yes,
in hindsight.
That's right. In Romans, it talks about how the consequence happens. So the federal headship, Romans 5 would be the good one, talking about the sin and its consequence upon us. And I think it's Romans 8, I think, which talks about the creation that groans. And again, I'll still look up more to see if there's any details we can add to this. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, now comes this. So if you're talking to a liberal who disbelieves that the book of Genesis was authentic, then this is the question they would have. Why are there two accounts of creation? So you may ask, why are there two accounts of creation? And if you do that, you're great. You get 100. But typically what some of the liberal scholars do is they look at chapter 1, they say, okay, there is an account of creation there. And you remember we talked about JEDP. So you have one way of looking at things. And then you look at Genesis 2, and you have, it looks like he's just saying the same thing again, almost like how you asked about the previous verse. Is it just repeating the same thing? What's going on? So the liberal view is, oh, there were just one account by one source and another account by another source, and Moses or some other author just concatenated them together, not realizing, oh, it looks kind of odd. That's the, and that's what preconceptions do to you. If you already come with that background, that's how you want to interpret those texts. But here we're going to take a few minutes to look at why God intended for us to have these accounts, which are similar in some ways. So what was God's intent over here? So if you look at Genesis 1 overall, what you see here is heavens and earth created in 6 days. This is like the big picture that you see of all creation. Whereas when you look at Genesis 2, the focus here is not on the big picture of creation, but rather on a smaller focus. It's about the creation of man and the creation of woman, and the point here is not about the broader picture within the 6-day time, but rather what happens in the 6th day with really no element of time mentioned. And again, the note in the brackets is to talk about those who think of a contradiction. This is not a contradiction, it is actually zooming in on one specific element. And again, here you have panorama of creation as a whole. You have a detailed focus of one aspect of creation, and that aspect is on man himself. Whereas on Genesis 1, the focus is on God. In the beginning, God creates all this. God spoke, God said, God saw. It's all about God in making the heavens and the earth. Whereas when you come to Genesis 2, it focuses on man as the crowning act of God's creation. Say that to a liberal and you'll get some. And God intends for man to be the recipient of this stewardship and responsibility. So that's basically what you see in the distinctions that you note in Genesis 1 and 2. I know most of you have gone through Genesis already in reading it. So as I'm going through, we may not touch on some things that you have read, but if you want to ask any questions or comment on something you've read, please feel free to do that. You may want to keep your Bibles open. Here we're going to do in this slide what is called a chiasm. It's another literary device. We're going to see chiasm in more detail much later, but we're going to see a few examples before we study them in detail. And a chiasm is like think of it as a mirror image. You'll have certain things leading up to something, and then at the point of the mirror image, it starts to turn back. So if you're looking at Genesis chapter 2, this is the chiastic breakdown that is seen in the text. So the first one, verses 1 to 3, as you can just scan the text here. So you have heaven and earth created, and God finished his work, and that's the first 3 verses. And then in verses 4 to 9, you can see there's 5 verses all talking about the creation of man, and more explicitly how he was created, taken from the dust, breathed in. And then the third element you see, verses 9 to 16, you have the trees and rivers in the garden, which are given names. So here is, obviously, the garden itself has a location, and the location you can guess by the name of the rivers that surround it. So physically, there are 4 rivers that are given. This is on verses 11. Verse 10 says it divides into 4 rivers, and then verse 11 to 14 is there. And then two of those rivers we know very well, and those are Tigris and Euphrates. So if you look at the map here, the lower, the two mirrors, so you have one here and one here. So this is the Euphrates and that's the Tigris. And those are the rivers that we know today to be the same. Whether they are the same rivers at that time or not, we cannot be 100% sure, but it's most likely this is what was being referred to then. So it's the modern region of Iraq that we're talking about. This location. And then after the trees and rivers are given names, man has the task of guarding and keeping the garden. So while you have the entire world created good with all these kinds of trees and vegetation and animals, there is a specific area, the Garden of Eden, where man has a responsibility to keep and care for it. And then you have verses 16 and 17. Actually, if someone has that, can you please read that out?
16 and 17.
Yes, please.
And the Lord commanded the man, saying, You may surely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For the day you eat of it, you shall surely die.
Thank you. So the one thing you want to think about until this point is man is innocent in the sense that he doesn't have a positive righteousness. He is made by God without sin, and he is the only, what do we call that? Your husband was talking about it last week. The only morally free creature. He was not constrained by sin in choosing to obey God. The Armenians today would call free will. He had true free will like you and I don't have, because he did not have the sin nature in him. And here you have a test of obedience that would give him positive righteousness. By listening to God and trusting in God and doing what God said, he would actually have what he doesn't have at this point, in his original created state. And the flip side of the test is if he disobeys God, God talks about a consequence that he will have. And the consequence in verse 17 is that you will surely die. And this is a death as we understand it is a separation of the body and our spirit. So when we die physically, our body goes down to the ground. We are made out of the dust, and to dust our body returns. So the spirit goes back to God, its maker. And then when you go back to God, its maker, then you have either the second death or you have life eternal. So when your spirit returns to God, you are either counted as righteous because of Christ's righteousness, and then you spend eternity with him, or you are judged for your sin, and then you are punished for eternity in hell. Anyway, so that's the way we look at death. And here for Adam, it would be a physical death that would be that would result, but also more importantly, a spiritual death, which would be a separation from God himself. So that's basically what you have with the forbidden fruit, and that's kind of like the peak of this chiasm. And then, okay, so we have that here on the next slide. And this is a tree that we don't have anymore. All right, but then now let's move to verse 18. So we're going to see the flip side of the chiasm, and I want you to just observe it. Here you see man is in need of a helper. It is not good for man to be alone. Man has a responsibility, he's assigned a task, and this man needs a helper in the responsibility that he shares with the woman and for himself as a person. And now, while on verse 9 to 14, you have the names of the trees and rivers. In verses 19 and 20, you have the animals in the garden that are given names. So you have all the animals of each kind passing through, and Adam names them. It is giving a naming ceremony is not just, I just say alphabet A, B, C, D. It's more of, understanding what these creatures are as he gives them this name, and his responsibility or rule over them that is demonstrated in this. And then you have the woman created in verses 21 to 24. Again, chiastically, if you look back, the man's creation, now you have woman's creation. And she is obviously made with a lot more care and detail. Man is just dust, but the woman comes off of a surgery, divine surgery, as Adam is goes under, and then you have the woman created. In fact, I don't think I talk about this much. Let me just read one thing. Actually, verse 23. As God makes her and brings her before him, the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of her man." The idea of being there is, there was no helper found for him in all the animals. And then he wakes up, he sees so many, he bursts out into song. That's basically the Hebrew emphasis. It's just, this is just a beautiful gift from God. God has given me the woman. And then you have the completion. So you have in the first three verses, the creation of the overall creation complete. And here you have this, the smaller focus complete as well. And it says, the man and woman were naked, but they were not ashamed. Again, they are in a state of innocence before God. All right. You won't have this in your printouts. I have a slide here that talks about chiasm. I think I added this. I thought the author had it later. Maybe he has it later too. But these are just some notes. So if you go on Moodle, you will see this extra slide there. I'll just read this out. A chiasm is a writing style that uses a unique repetition pattern for clarification and/or emphasis. And you see this both in the Old and the New Testament as well. So don't feel like you have to write this down. I probably won't ask this in the quiz, but this is there in the printout, in the PDF file that's attached to your Moodle. All right, now comes the big problem. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was desirable to make one wise, she took from its fruit and ate. And she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. Trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. So here you have, actually, I didn't talk about how she came to take this up. So here comes the serpent, who is craftful and deceitful, and asks a very loaded question to Eve. Did God say, "Don't eat of anything"? He clearly knew what God had said, but he is trying to push her in a direction, and then she was obviously not the first recipient of the divine command to Adam. Adam was the one who heard it from God, and either she must have heard from God and Adam, or just from Adam, but she knew enough to say that this God allowed us to eat of everything except this one tree, and then she also says, we shouldn't touch it. She adds a few more details to what she shouldn't do. But then Satan tempts her, and he says, he tempts her by saying that God is not good. He is withholding something from you that you need, because you will be like God. You will know things. Let's just look at what he says. First in verse 4, you will surely not die. And then verse 5, your eyes will be open and you will know good and evil like God. It is a tree of good and evil. And it was partly right there. But the part he fails to emphasize is that this will, you would not be like God. Instead, you will die, as God has actually said. And he said you will not die. And so she now has to stand here as it were in the middle, and she has what God has said and what she has heard from Adam, and what the devil has said. And again, as a morally free will creature, she can get to choose. And instead of saying, I trust in God and I would obey him, she says, I will be the judge of what is good and evil, and then determines that this is what is good. And you can see the threefold focus there. She sees it is good for food. It's not that was the only tree that was there for food. There was plenty of other trees, but she decided that was a good thing for her. Delight to the eyes, and that it is desirable to make one wise. It's the pride that comes from it, and she takes and eats, and her husband also eats. Now, this is, I think, worth taking a minute or two to talk about. What are the results from their actions before we talk about the rest of Genesis 3? today, what are the results of their actions of taking and eating the forbidden fruit?
We're all born in sin with a sin nature.
We no longer have that high standing that Adam and Eve were created in, because we lost it with that one seemingly innocuous action, but it was a weighty, dreadful sin. And not that she did it and we did it, we probably would have done the same. But as a result of that, we no longer have the communion that Adam and Eve had.
But wasn't it, I mean, Adam's the one that's more culpable here, isn't he?
Yes,
She was deceived. He ate knowingly. He didn't step in and
That's
protect her.
I'm actually glad
And
you
he's
said
a federal head.
yes.
So,
Yes. For those of you who are not familiar with it, Pastor Mike recently preached on this, talking about where was Adam when he was tempted. And looking at the text, it's quite likely that he was pretty close to her and not doing what he should have done, which is guard and protect and resisted the devil.
I believe Paul also talks about the fact that he didn't do what he's supposed to.
Yeah, I don't remember the reference. Do you know what text that is?
I don't remember.
Yeah, there is actually a sermon on this in probably the last 4 or 5 months that speaks on this. Yes.
The chosen words for that is that he died at the fall. He became dead.
Right.
And that is a shame. Put that in English, that's not what happened. He became locked out of truth. That means he lacks discernment. He cannot design discerning things. Natural man is without discernment.
And that's in 1 Corinthians. It talks about the consequence of how man is. I think Ephesians 2 will talk about the first part of what you said. Dead in trespasses and sin. That's what our state is. Because in Adam we are dead. And then in 1 Corinthians, I forget the chapter, it talks about how as a natural man, we just don't have the access to truth. We can't see it as Adam and Eve once did.
That's right. It has no meaning whatsoever to us, to the natural man.
That's right. Yes.
For all practical purposes, he is dead. But what it's saying, he eats and lives and has kids and everything, but he is locked out from discerning truth.
That's excellent. Because, that's what most people would ask. Wait a minute. God said he would surely die. He is still living. In what sense is he living?
Well, yeah. For in eternity, he is dead.
Right.
I mean, that's eternal death. That's a piece of that.
Right.
Death has several meanings, and we fly through that in English as though we're on top of it all and understand it all, and we don't have a translation in our English language that separates this and makes this clear. That has to come from the pulpit. You've got to tell us what that is.
Yeah, no, actually, I'm glad you actually talked about some of them. And I think it's helpful for us to just talk about a few of those things now. When you think about physical death, up until this point, there was no death. There was no physical death at all. All of these.
What is it?
What is it? Yeah, we're going to talk about each of them. The first thing that comes as a consequence of the fall is there is going to be a physical death. And actually, when you look back, that is actually a blessing rather than a curse on Adam. Because here is Adam in a state of rebellion against God, and he could have continued to live eternally on earth, in his rebellion, in his blindness. But God brings about, when you look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, you're going to see the ages in the average of about 900 years. And then I think it is Genesis 4. Genesis 5, you will see, and he died, and he died, and he died. And right here, right after this whole thing happens, you're going to see them given, they're going to try to make fig leaves because they recognize, their eyes are opened as the
Satan did say. But what they realized was not they say things like God, but they just saw their shamefulness and where they actually stand. And that's what happens. They have lost their innocence, and instead of righteousness that would have come by obedience, they now have sin and the consequence death. So you have physical death that initiates, but you have the death that you were talking about. There is a blindness that comes in the truth. You're separated from the truth, and you are sinfully separated from God Himself. And that is visibly shown in Adam and Eve now being kicked out of the garden. They were given dominion over this. Now they are taken out, and then there will be an angel that will protect them from coming and eating of the tree of life. That's basically what would have, prolonged the rebellion. But now they no longer have access. Both the trees were there. Before they ate of the knowledge of good and evil, they could have eaten of the tree of knowledge of life, but they didn't. And now they are barred from it. And so now you see the death that and actually, that is not without reason that people call this the fall. Here was man created in his pristine state, and then you have the fall. And then today, most people would look at Christians and say, what kind of a God creates this universe we live in? And our God created, Genesis 1, good, 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 very good. And then you have here the consequence of mankind that we see all around us. And the hope for this is that even in the midst of this, God promises a Redeemer. So we're going to see that in this passage. In fact, actually, I didn't mention this in the previous slide. So when we look at the consequence, we see suffering, sin, pain all around us. And that was one of the consequences of this fall. And then God confronts Adam. Adam, when he sins, he wants to go back and hide. He and Eve, make the fig leaves for their own. You cannot come before God in His presence with sin in yourself, and they try to make for themselves their own righteousness. It's like pretty much the religions of the world today. We try to do things on our own to try to somehow make ourselves acceptable before God, but all that will help them do is hide behind the bushes, and God has to call and bring them out, and then He will provide for them His garment. He will give them clothes of skin. And the implication, it is not drawn out here, but the implication clearly being that something had to die to give its skin for Adam and Eve. And there is going to be a consequence for sin. And it's like a prototype of the sacrifices that you will have in the Old Testament, how there is a substitute for the one who sinned, because God in His graciousness provides a way for the sinner to be right with Him. And
so I guess with that in mind, I've heard our Sproul teach on this passage, and he said the language here is that on the day you shall surely die. And he said we can't really just say it was spiritual death that he was talking about. He was talking about death.
yes.
And so what we really have here is God's grace.
Right.
So he relented, as it were, and there was death that day, and it was the animal who died in the place of man and covered man for a while as the prototype for the sacrificial system.
That's excellent, because I think there is a consequence, and the aspects of death we talked about, those are all true. But the thing is that why did Adam not die then and there? Is because God provided
grace
for him in grace. Excellent. And the thing is, so that's why I think we will see Adam in heaven, while Cain we will not. And we will see how God is gracious. Now, in Adam, everybody fell. And I think this is worth talking about again for a minute, and we'll still get to Genesis to the end. But the thing is, this is important because many people look at Reformed teaching and say, I can't accept this kind of a God. I want a God who just says, everybody, you're created equally. Every single one of you just jump as high as you can. The one that jumps highest gets in. That's the kind of God we like. We don't like a God who picks and chooses. But if you understand the fall well, I think that becomes a lot clearer. Because in Adam, everybody was going straight, is dead. They're going straight to hell. There is really no man who can jump any height that they think is capable of meeting God. It's all fig leaves. Nobody can do this. And God graciously, like with Adam, He provides a way for those whom He is gracious to. And that's the whole point of grace. Grace is free, unmerited favor. It is not a checking account that says, here is all the things that God has to do. God does it out of His own favor. But so you have three other things that happen here. So God confronts Adam. Adam, instead of acknowledging his sin, like what we are supposed to do, we are to confess our sin and repent. Instead, Adam says, the woman, the one whom he sang praises to, that you gave me, which is blaming God for, she's the one who made me do it. And again, here is man made as a head, as a ruler, as a responsible person, and here he's acting, like a second grader, if you will, just saying, it's her fault. I mean, it's just shocking to see, and this is tragically, even in marriages, you can see how husbands today don't know what it means to be leaders, to take the heat for what goes wrong in the family. It's always, it's this or that. And but anyway, Adam shifts the blame, but he's going to be accounted for. Woman, she shifts the blame to the serpent. And then this is the curse to the serpent in Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman. He's talking to the serpent here again, talking to the devil. Between your seed and her seed, which is your descendants and her descendants. And he shall bruise you. He is the singular seed of Eve. This language is very, very unusual. You don't have descendant of a woman talked about in the singular. Normally it's talked about the generations, Adam's descendants, Noah's descendants, Abraham's descendants. But here he's talking explicitly to the seed of a woman. And this is what I believe is the proto-evangelion. This is the gospel right there talking about Jesus Christ who will come, born of a woman, who will bruise Satan on the head, and you shall bruise him, the serpent, on his heel. So you have the cross where this culminates, where the rulership, man was given the rulership over earth, man abdicates it to the devil, and here you have Christ coming back to redeem mankind from his sin. And when he does that, he gives Satan a death blow, if you will, because you see in 1 Peter 3, he leads, and Ephesians 4, Christ, when he conquered death, he leads all his captives in a triumphant procession before God. And that's basically where Satan is already destroyed. Now, the other two consequences we're not talking about here, one is the suffering for the woman in childbirth. Again, what should be a joyous, glorious occasion, and still is endued with pain, and then the conflict that the woman has with her husband in terms of wanting to be his head. Again, started in the garden and with a curse, and then man has to suffer by the sweat of his brow, and the ground is cursed for his sake, and now bears thorns and thistles, and man has to work hard to labor. Just talking about how it could have been different in the garden before the curse begins. Now, on the next slide, you have something that John Stevenson does, which I really like. He talks about the two generations. The one generation that's godly, and he titles that the seed of the woman. What is the descendants of this woman that is in the godly line, and then the other seed, which is the seed of the serpent, which is the ungodly line. And so you have in Genesis 4, Cain and Abel. Cain is the older one, and Abel the second. In fact, when you look at Cain, in verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, she says, he bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. In fact, she could be thinking back at the seed of the woman. This is the man that God has provided that will destroy the serpent. That's probably what's running through her mind. She obviously didn't know, and we know now that Christ was the one who was to come to rescue her. But so her hope was on her firstborn son, Cain, and this is not really the one that was a redeemer, as Genesis 4 makes it very clear. In fact, I want to just point to you. In Genesis 5, verse 1, God created man. He made him in the likeness of God. So this is the image of God in man. Man was created in God's image. But then, verse 3, when Adam lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. So you're going to be seeing this thing of the image of God in man. And that image of God is not lost. So you and I still have the image of God, because if you go a little further, I don't have the reference here, where it talks about the penalty of murder. it is death. By if you spill man's blood, by man your blood shall be spilled, because in the image, because man is made in the image of God. We still share the image of God, although it is in a fallen state, not in the pristine state like Adam was. But the descendants of man have the image of Adam with his fallen state, rather than how God created Adam in the first place. So
Hey,
the
Pradeep.
question here, how is the Cain and Abel narrative related to the larger story of Genesis? What you're going to see is Adam and Eve couple. You're going to see the descendants coming out, and you're going to see some who will follow like Abel in the godly path, wanting to please God and follow after him, and others like Cain who will follow the serpent. In fact, if you look at, I think, John 8 or 9, Jesus will talk about those who confront him and say, "You are of your father, the devil." And that's basically where all of us are until God adopts us into his family. But here in the book of Genesis, you're going to see Noah. And then after Noah, the generations come, then you're going to see Abraham's family come out. And the rest of the people go down their own path, following the seed of the serpent. But we'll follow that through.
Hey, Pradeep.
But in Cain and Abel, you know what happens.
Pradeep,
So,
can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you.
The camera shifted a little bit to the left. Can you have somebody stand up and move the camera just slightly to the right? I'm looking directly at you, and I can't really see the screen.
Yeah, let me open up the camera here so I can see it.
Where are you turning the camera?
Yeah, I think it needs to move, but I don't know how much, so I'll open the camera here. Actually, I can't see the camera. You can see the camera, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, it's focused. You're in the center of the picture, so it's like cutting off like half of the screen.
Yes, this comes. Yeah, actually, Ali was here. He said that this may be a motion detection camera or something. Is that,
Oh, that's
does
better.
that sound right, Jonathan?
Yeah, it can. I don't know how to program it correctly, so, but that's a better view right now.
Is that okay? So is this okay now, the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, so let's go back to the slide. Oh, it's 8. Maybe with this slide, if we need to take a break, we can take a 5-minute break after the slide once it's back. Okay. So here we have the event of Cain and Abel. Again, I'm not going to spend time here, but you know how both these sons of Adam bring their offerings to God. Abel herds from the they knew from God what was expected from them. They both probably brought what was good from their own particular profession, in a husband versus a farmer. But what was brought before God was done not for in Abel's case what God wanted. I had asked them to do, and again, if you go back to Genesis 3, that seems to be the indication there. And then in Cain's case, he doesn't, and then he is unhappy that God would favor Abel but not himself, and he wants his way rather than God's way. And in doing so, just like Eve did, he follows after the path of the serpent. And you have here I think this is the 7th in line, if I'm not mistaken, Lamech, who is the descendant of Cain. And then let me just look at Lamech for a moment. Yeah. So in chapter 4, verse 18, you have Lamech born. And then when you look at the life of Lamech, it is just horrific. He's the first polygamist that's recorded for us. Verse 23, he has 2 wives, and then he basically says, verse 24, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, again, Cain is made a nomad, a wanderer, and he said, when he pleads to God, God is merciful even to Cain and says, someone kills you, there will be a sevenfold punishment. And then Lamech says is 77-fold.
he just talks about killing a man for wounding him and a young man for striking. And you just see not just the descendants of Cain follow the ungodly path, but just getting worse and worse as they go further and further away from God. And that's, as we just heard, there is a separation from God and from the truth of God that happens in the ungodly line. Whereas the godly line, in Abel's case, he came to worship God as God had appointed. And then you have in verse 25, Adam had relations with his wife again after Abel's death, and she bore him a son, Seth, because here is someone to take the place of Abel, and he will continue the godly line after him. And so the term another offspring in the Hebrew is literally another seed. And then we have a little comparison here between the, if you remember Genesis 1 to 11, these were the 4 events, and then you have Genesis 12 through 50, the 4 people. But even within Genesis 1 to 11, you can compare them along these lines. So you have the creation history, and then you have the sons of Adam. In fact, I heard a sermon preached which was just talking about and he died, and he died, and he died, just talking about the death that came in with the fall. But then you also have the godly line that is listed there. And you see Enoch, for example, is a man who we will actually have to talk about a little bit later. But let's look at the comparison. So you have the sons of Adam that are listed here. Technological development, you talk about the tools and utensils, the kind of technology that man develops in chapter 4. And then you are given 10 generations from Adam to Noah in chapter 5. Again, not necessarily contiguous. These are 10 that are listed for us from Adam all the way to Noah. And then if you look at Noah's history in chapter 7 through 11, you have Noah's son given just like the parallelism with Adam's sons. And then while you have the technological development of mankind in chapter 4, you have the ethnic development of mankind in chapter 10. And what that really means is we're going to see the flood in more detail. But what's going on there is the descendants of Noah are populating and producing the various nations that you see. So if you go back and look at Genesis 10, it talks about, these are the people that were descendants from Shem, from Ham, and they went and these peoples came out of this. So the ethnic development is given in that chapter. And again, in chapter 11, you have 10 generations that are listed from Noah to Terah. So you can see how God intended for us to have some form in the way in which this history is communicated to us. Once again, I wouldn't nail that as a specific descendants, but these are the names that are given. Again, last week we talked about how in Matthew's genealogy too, we have the same idea of the key people that are listed. But again, the author here, there's some parallelism that you can see between the texts. But before we go to Noah, there is a little bit of an interlude. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Actually, let's stop here before we look at this. We can take a 5-minute break and then restart. So let's go to Genesis 6 as we continue through Genesis. We're going to pick up the pace here. As you can see in the first 2 verses, you have an event which is kind of confusing. Men multiply, so you have people populating the land, and men and daughters, and then you have the term there called sons of God. And so the daughters of men as beautiful, and they took wives whomever they chose. The question is, what exactly is the sons of God talking about? And as a result, we're going to see verses 3 and 4 as well. And there is something that was sinful going on that God says, my spirit shall not strive with man because he is flesh and his days shall be 120 years. So he limits the age of man. Actually, you will see a huge drop after the time of Noah, where, as we said, the average age was 900 before Noah, and after that it just drops significantly. And actually, if you look at Answers in Genesis, they have a few theories on how God could have changed the environment as well as part of that. And then you have verse 4 in Genesis 6, the Nephilim were on the earth. And who are these Nephilim? And now you have the sons of God again, and the daughters of men, and their children, who were the mighty men of old, who were of renown. So now, once again, the question is, who does sons of God refer to? So there are three theories. Hello. There are 3 theories here. The first one is that it refers to angels. And so here are all the evidence for that. So the Septuagint, the translation, the big translation of the Hebrew Old Testament calls them angels. So that's one reason for it. The second is, look at the book of Job, chapter 1. It talks about the sons of God in heaven, and it is actually talking about angels there, so they're used synonymously. And then the objection to it might be, well, angels in heaven don't marry, but so how could they have married? And the answer would be that these angels are not in heaven. They have some physical corporeal form while on earth. And then and the resulting offspring produce giants. So there's something that is very unique in the offspring, and the reason being that this could be because they are angels. Now, the book of Enoch, which is an apocryphal book, seems to support this. Jude 6, not so much so. Jude 6 basically says the angels that did not keep their proper position were cast down into chains. And I think, could it be? Maybe, but we don't know for sure. But again, these are all the evidences given for why that might refer to as angels. The other argument, and I think this is the one that was most commonly taken, which is that we have these 2 lines, the one of the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And so this could actually be talking about the sons of God, talking about the godly line. And then because we have here, men began to call upon the name of the Lord as they had separated out of the Garden of Eden, and they were looking up to God, and there was only one line that did, and the other cared for their own names. And all of mankind is punished. You don't see angels being punished in the flood. And sonship is a common theme in the Old Testament. So you have Israel is my son. You have this men who are called sons of God in that sense. And so the marriage of the godly and the ungodly is another theme in the book of Genesis. So especially in Abraham and then with Israel, you will see how these people of God are meant to not mingle with the ungodly and thereby follow the false gods that they were worshiping. That's another theme. So these are all the arguments for this referring to the descendants of Seth. And you have a third view, and this is what I was reading Walter Kaiser, I think, and he was talking about this. This again looks at it purely from a linguistic standpoint of the ancient texts, where the sons of God actually can talk about just kings and rulers. And the Aramaic lends to this interpretation. And Elohim can refer to human judges, and these are the texts where the Bible uses it that way. It is used similarly in Babylonian texts, and kings were often called as Elohim. And the term Nephilim refers to the fallen ones. So here you are the rulers who have fallen. But, we've skipped the slide. So the point being, here are the 3 different views. I'm not going to use come down on one or the other. In fact, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think MacArthur uses the first one, which is sons of God referring to angels. And I've seen for the first 2 a lot, not the third one as much, except recently that I read. But again, as I said, it's one of those curiosity points. We don't, and these giants will be referred to later when you come back into Canaan, and so that will be another time when this comes back. But okay, now let's get to the story of Noah. And I have on my slide here the actual Hebrew and the way you pronounce it. It's not there in your handout, but again, all of this is there in the Moodle document. So if you just get your Moodle document, you can see the right print for the Hebrew words there. But actually, what you do see in your printout is actually a way of pronouncing it, and I'll maybe I might tell you how to read it when you get here. So here's Genesis 6:14. So you have God determining in the beginning of Genesis 6 a judgment that is to come because mankind was sinful and doing things in its own way, and then He chooses Noah, and then basically places His favor upon him, and then wants to rescue him from the judgment that has come. There's going to be a flood, so Noah's to build an ark. And actually, if you look at the bottom of this slide, the word ark is the same word that is used for the ark into which the baby Moses was placed. And I don't think I have a. So you shall make yourself an ark of gopher wood with rooms, cover it inside and outside with pitch. So the word ark, Teba, is what you have over here. And if you look at your printout, Hebrew reads from the right to the left. So the first letter word is Te. Actually, this is not the Hebrew that I'm most familiar with, but this is the one I could find to fix the argument. But do you know? Does anyone here know Hebrew? Ali, does he know?
No, he doesn't. I
Okay.
need to know the alphabet.
Okay, but this is not. I mean, most of us study the font with the capitals, which is a little different than this. But this is the H. I think that's the B, which is the B. But when you read from left to right, and if you look at your notes, it has TE and then semicolon and BT. So without the vowels, it's Teva. And Genesis verse 15. This is the precise dimensions of the ark. So you have a picture here of what it could have looked like. 300 cubits. A cubit is about 1.5 feet. So you can just multiply by 1.5 times to get the feet equivalent of this. And it's huge. It's very huge. But this is what God had asked Noah to build. Now, here is again the chiasm in the next slide of the content is pointing towards one thing. It begins with the 3 sons of Noah in verse 10. And then there is a covenant with Noah in verse 18, where God promises, here is what is going to come, the judgment. And this is a judgment that is universal, which is throughout the entire planet, you're going to have a flood. And then there is a provision for Noah saying, here's what you need to do, the food that you need to take and place in the ark. And then in chapter 7, when everything is finished, Noah and his family entered. So it's just 8 people. Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives. They entered the ark. And then in chapter 7 and 8, you see the flood happen. That's the peak of this chiasm. And then you see now the mirror image. Chapter 8, verse 14, the family in the flood come out of the ark. The command not to eat blood as opposed to the command to take food. And actually, until this point, everyone's vegetarian. And it's after the flood that you have the clean and the unclean animals. Man is allowed to eat animals, but there are some provisions there where you are not to eat the blood because the life of the animal is in the blood. And so you must not eat it. And then just as the covenant with Noah in the beginning about the judgment that is to come and the provision to rescue him, there is also the covenant of Noah in chapter 9 where you have the rainbow, where God promises not to destroy the earth with a flood. And so there will no longer be a universal flood, but there will be a judgment that comes again. In fact, Noah is a sign of the judgment that is to come at the end. And this time it will be the fire. And again, it concludes with the section of Noah's 3 sons. So Noah's 3 sons are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And you're going to see shortly how, as we touched on this earlier, there is an ethnic population of the earth that goes out from the descendants of Noah. And these 3 sons, again, inherit blessings and curses based on what they actually do. I'm trying to see if there's anything I need to point out here. Any questions on Noah as a whole before we? Oh no, actually there's more on Noah. So the next slide. I need to. Okay, so now we are if you look at the flood on the peak of this whole thing. Now we're going to see what that, we're going to see that in a little more detail. So you have this ark that was made with a door, but it is a door that Noah cannot shut. He goes in and then it is the Lord shuts it upon him. And then it is only at that point, until this point, 100 years of making, people mock at him, laugh at him, and Noah is a preacher of righteousness, we read later in Hebrews. While he's preaching, they are all mocking at him. But when the door is shut and it starts raining, people beg for mercy, it seems. Let me not leave it. That's why you shouldn't watch too many movies. I would imagine people would have done that, but I don't think the text talks about people actually asking for it. But this was something that the people were unused to, because this is not just an ordinary flood, because you have rains, you have the fountains of the deep broken up, you have a catastrophe on the planet Earth like nothing that has happened before. And there is really no peak you could climb high enough, because every peak is going to be underwater. And the rain itself was 40 days and 40 nights. And the waters increase until the mountains are covered. So really, this is where we would call this a global flood rather than a local flood, like a lot of the scholars would want to debate for. And then this was not just a time, like a grand swimmer, you could just swim and try to wade it out. This is for 150 days that these waters prevail upon the earth. And then you have, again, this is again a chiasm where God remembers Noah, or has his favor upon Noah, and he's going to bring Noah back into the count. And so just as the 150 days of water prevailing, 150 days the waters abate, and the waters start to drain down, and then until the mountains become visible. And again, you can see the chiastic pattern here. And then after 40 days, Noah opens the window, and then the rest of the sequence. He sends a crow, and he sends a dove, and later it returns with an olive branch, and then they come out into the land. So we have Genesis 8:4. Finally, it rests upon the mountains of Ararat. So here, Ararat is not necessarily a peak, but rather a range of mountains. And you have the possible location of Ararat in Turkey that's listed on this map. So it's somewhere in that region, those are the mountains where the ark came to rest. Unless you're the latest lost ark, you're still looking for it. And so here is the covenant that is made, the Noahic covenant we talked about in week 1. God spoke to Noah and his sons, saying, "Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you, and then your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you." And then it's the bird, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, and of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast. So this is a covenant with Noah, Noah's descendants, and with all of the creatures of the earth. And we touched on this already, so I'm not going to talk too much on this. You have a new slide which has a little bit more detail about what a covenant is. A covenant is an agreement, a promise, or which has its inherent blessings and curses that is between God and man. And these, as we saw last time, this can be either conditional or an unconditional covenant. And the covenant that is placed here is an unconditional one, where God promises not to destroy all of mankind with a flood. And this is not dependent upon man fulfilling certain things. And so this is a blessing upon all of us, and the sign of that being the rainbow. Again, you see this in verse 11. All right, so now we're going to see an event which is kind of, for us, maybe a little confusing. So Genesis 9:20 to 22, Noah is a farmer, plants a vineyard, drinks wine and becomes drunk, and uncovered himself inside his tent. Now, right there, remember we talked about right and wrong, shame and honor. This would be a shameful thing to happen, that a man became drunk and uncovered himself. That's painful, and for us also, right? wrong. And then you have in verse 22, Ham, who is one of the sons of Noah, also the father of Canaan. I think we need to be a little careful here because when we actually, let me stop. We'll talk about it in a slide. But the father of Canaan, who is the son of Ham, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. And again, verse 23. This is what Ham should have done. They take a carpet on their shoulders, walk backward, and cover their dead with their faces turned away. This is what Shem and Japheth did. But then when Noah awoke, he knew what Ham had done. And then instead of cursing Ham, he actually curses Canaan, the son of, and he shall be a servant to his brothers. And on the flip side, he says, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, that Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, that's the other son, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. And again, the point being that, as the firstborn, Shem is the one who was blessed. Japheth, who also did what was right and honored his dad, he pronounces a blessing upon him. And then Canaan would be the one who is the servant of the other two brothers. Now, there's a textual question here, which I'm not going to spend too much time on. And the question is, actually, before that, Japheth. The name Japheth, you have, that's a yod. Do you know what that middle letter is? Yeah, the last one is, again, a T. But they both sound similar. So if you had to read it in English, it would be Patah Yafet. So if you just take the out, it's the same sounding word, enlarged and Japheth having the same root words. May God Japheth, or maybe enlarge the enlarged one. It's more like, may he bless him abundantly, and that's the name of Japheth anyway. Again, just a textual point. But here the question is, let him dwell in the tents of Shem. The immediate referent for that is Japheth, so that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. But the broader referent to him would be God himself, that God would dwell in the tents of Shem, so that the descendants of Shem will have God dwelling with them. So those would be the two ways in which you can interpret this text. Again, I'm not going to, he's going to talk a little bit more about this. And here, what the author is trying to, John Stevenson is trying to say is, this is a picture of the Israel coming out of Egypt, going into the Promised Land. The tabernacle and all the different tribes of Israel around. And this is talking about, here is how God dwells in the tent of Shem. God in the midst of the Israelites. So once again, you see the different slides, the seed of serpent, the seed of the woman. And now, under Noah, you see the split again happening, where Ham is cursed and Shem is blessed. And Ham's descendant is Canaan, whereas the descendant of Shem would be Abraham. And now, if you think about actually, I think that's the next slide. So the point here is, and I think this you need to be a little cautious on. So here is something that has happened several generations before, and this is where Canaan is cursed and Shem is blessed. And now you have their descendants come forth, and you have Abraham, and then now you have Moses, 400 years later, and several years later. And then you have Canaan and the descendants of Canaan in the Promised Land. And now, how do these two relate as Moses and Joshua are to lead the people of God back into the Promised Land, the land where Canaan is inhabiting, and the land which will spit out Canaan because of the descendants of Canaan, because their wickedness has reached the limit, and God is kicking them out as He brings His people back in. So once again, you see the blessings and the cursings from the earlier point to where it actually terminates as the book of as the Pentateuch is being written. All right, so now we come to the end of the first section, Genesis 11. So up until this point, everybody has the same language. They settled in the plain of Shinar. So Shinar, again, within the Mesopotamian region, the Fertile Crescent, between the rivers. And in verses 3 and 4, again, a classic decision of man to make himself a name, make himself big, and to do things on his own standard rather than what God would have them do. So as his technology becomes greater, as he's able to do much more, much bigger things than he was able to do before, his goal is to build a tower, build himself a name, and rather than get scattered across the face of the whole earth, when God had said, you need to fill the earth, you need to multiply and have dominion over it. Man says, no, I want to do things my way. And this is how they think the ziggurat, the tower, could have looked like. And I think there was, so we have a picture here. This is actually, I forget in which country they made this thing up, and that's a real play. So you have the scale of what they tried to build today. What it could be like that. Now, this place in China, what happens is God now intervenes and confuses the language and scatters them. He accomplishes his plan irrespective of man wanting to do things in his own way and stand in one location. So, because God scattered the people in that land, at that point it's called Babel. And there was a confusion of languages. So as the people of one language are communicating and building up this thing, God comes in, the people now all start speaking in different languages. And so the general understanding is that this was probably 3 different major language roots, and they basically went down separated at this point. And so Babel is the root for, and the word for confusion, like Babel, I think there's another word here, Babel. And this, those are the same 2 root words, which are very similar. And here you have God confusing them. And this is where Babylon is. So this is the ancient city, and that name continues further into later in the book, in the Old Testament as well. So the location is still the same. So now let's look at the overall picture. So in Genesis 5, you have 10 generations from Adam to Noah. There are 3 sons. Actually, you can think about 3 sons of Adam and now 3 sons of Noah. And then you have Noah having 10 generations all the way up to Terah. And then he has 3 sons. Abram is one of them. And actually, we're going to start with the slide on Abraham just now. Let's just Genesis 1 to 11. Any questions? Okay, we're going to start on week 3 PowerPoint, which will cover from Genesis 12 to 50. And we'll try to go through some of the major sections there. I don't think we'll finish it today, but when the PowerPoint goes. As you remember, Babel, what were the 4 key events in Genesis 1 to 11?
Creation.
Tower of Babel, yeah. So those are the 4 major events. We didn't spend as much time on the Tower of Babel, but that was the last event there. And we are all descendants of Noah. We're all descendants of Adam. The question that we're going to see a little more focus in this section is, how do you discern the seed of the serpent and the seed of
Eve. And how do you see the godly and the ungodly land unpack itself from Abram all the way down to Joseph? I probably should have done. Oh, it's still open. Okay. So, another minute or two. That's not it. Okay, I'll take the units. In case it just hangs. All right, while that's coming up. All right, so Suresh, you just gave us the four key events in Genesis 1 to 11. What are the four main people in Genesis 12 to 15?
Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph.
Yeah, that's right. So we're just going to walk through them. Okay, so you have the events again. These are just captured there. So we'll do. Okay, so what you have here in Genesis 1 to 11 is the race, the humankind as a whole. What are our origins? Where did we come from? So we understand both the work of God in making us and the two lines of mankind is where those who follow God and those who didn't follow God, and what has culminated until you come to this point in Genesis 12. Whereas Genesis 12 to 50 is about the family of Abraham. So God is going to place his favor upon Abraham just as he places favor upon Noah, and then through his descendants he is going to bless the rest of his people in the rest of time. So the Genesis 1 to 11 over 2,000 years. Genesis 12 through 50 is only about 250 years. So here is Genesis 11:27. Terah is the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. So three sons of Terah, and Haran is dead while Terah was still in the Ur of the Chaldeans. I think you might have on that. Yeah, we'll see that in a minute. So, so what we have here is Abram and Nahor also took wives, Sarai and Milcah, and then Sarah was barren and has no child. And again, here is one of those ways in which God promises and delivers his promise to his people in the way in which he gives them a son. And now here comes the migration. So in verses 31 to 32 of Genesis 11, Terah took his son and his grandson Lot and Abram's wife Sarai, and then they go from Ur and they're going to Canaan. And again, if you remember the Fertile Crescent, they have to go north before they turn south, and they go as far as Haran, but settle in Haran, which is on the northern part. We'll see that in the next map. And Terah dies in Haran. He's 205 years old at this time. So this is the map. So you have four, down some further south than Babel, and then he goes all the way up to Haran on the north, going up the Fertile Crescent, but doesn't come down to Canaan on this side. And you will see that Abraham will continue that journey further down. And with Genesis 12, you have the call of Abraham, where God tells Abraham, leave your country and your father's house to the land that I will show you. The word for country there is Aretz. You might have heard this. Haaretz, I think it's the newspaper in Israel. and it's just this is the land, and the land is a big deal. I'm not sure if you guys heard about the news this last couple of days. There's been some terrorist attacks in Houston, right? And today, I think someone, son of a Boston rabbi, was killed. I think this conflict there is about the land, and the question is, did God give this land or not? And then there's a promise to Abram at this point. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. And this is an unconditional promise, the covenant that's given to him. And in verse 3, this talks about the relationship of Abraham with the others around him. So there is a blessing to those who will bless Abram, and those who curse him, God will curse. And then you have the last one, again, another proto-euangelion. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. So it is through Abraham that God chooses to place his favor. And we see that culminate in the coming of Christ, who is a descendant of Abraham. And then through him, the Gentiles as well. All right, so you have Abram now coming to the land of Canaan in verse 5. And God promises to Abram while he's in Canaan that he will give to his descendants this land. And literally the word descendants there is to your seed. And you have this form of worship with altars that you will start to see, beginning with Abraham all the way up until Joseph and Jacob. So now the descendant, or to your seed, who could that descendant be? So here are Abram's options. The first is Lot. As you know, his brother had died, and this is his nephew that is with him. So is that going to be his descendant? And then Abram asked God, will my line be carried forth by Eliezer, who is my servant from Damascus? And then God tells him in Genesis 15, verse 4, this man will not be your heir, but the one who comes forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. Once again, all of this is because Sarah was barren and they were getting old. It didn't seem humanly possible for the promise of God to be fulfilled out of Abraham and Sarai. So the question was, who else could it be? And God says, no, it may seem impossible for you, but I will make that happen from your own body, and you shall be your heir. And then you have Genesis 15, the covenant ceremony, and I think this is important for us to grasp. So God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove and a young pigeon. So you have 3 animals that are 3 years old, and then you have 2 birds. And he, that is Abraham, brought all these to God, and then cut them into and laid them each half opposite the other. I don't know if I have more details on this. Actually, I don't. So we'll talk about this. He cuts each of these animals into, lays them aside, and he did not cut the birds. And then you have the ceremony. When it came about when the sun had set and it was very dark, behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch which passed between these pieces. And on that day, God made a covenant with Abraham. You actually what you see there is as Abram does this and he's waiting for the covenant to be done, the birds come, he chases the birds away, but there is a dark and I think a dreadful sleep that comes upon Abram. And you see now God passing between the split animals. Typically the covenant, and again this is what we talked about last week, the word for covenant is verit, which is to cut. And the idea being that when 2 kings come together and make a pact or a deal, they walk between these animals, and the idea is, whether it is a border dispute or whether it is, the agreement to how they're going to interact with one another. If one of them reneges on a promise, the idea is that God might curse them and that he would be cut like these animals have been cut. So that's basically what the covenant, the cut, the word covenant is like cut, and this is the symbol that it is referring to. But here, the strange thing is that Abraham is actually in a deep sleep. He is not the active participant. It is God who walks between this. And so this is the unconditional nature of the covenant that is actually done here. God, on his own name, makes a covenant to Abraham, saying, I will bless you surely by my own name. So when you once again look at the son for Abram, so the first two, Lot and Eliezer, are what humanly we would think is possible. But then, even though God promised out of your own body, Abram is unwilling, well, not Abram, Sarah is unwilling to wait, given that it has been such a long time. And she is surely convinced that she cannot bear a child. And so she asks for Abram to have Hagar, her Egyptian maid, so that through her, Abram can have a son of his own body. Now, this would be the custom of those times where someone who is rich and wealthy would be permitted to do this. Now, Abram heeds Sarah and has a son named Ishmael. And God has to come and tell him that it is not through Ishmael, but rather it is through Sarah that he will bear a son. So he comes when he's 75 years old, and then he comes again when he's 99, and he finally tells him next year, this time, you will have a son. And Sarah actually laughs when she hears this, how is this possible? I'm so old. And God says, this you did not believe, and she gets scared, but then God promises him a son, and very so surely the next year she has a son, and she names him Isaac because she just can't understand how God has done this for her. There is joy in the family. But I think I need to say a few more things here. Yeah. So when you think about Sarah, about Isaac and Ishmael, as you know, when Ishmael is born, Hagar starts to have contempt for Sarah. I have a child and you don't, and so Sarah gets upset. She drives Hagar out, and but God meets Hagar and sends her back, and she basically thinks that Ishmael is going to die. God provides for her. She calls him the God who sees, and then Ishmael comes back and stays with Abraham. But then when Isaac is born, once again you see the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac, and then Sarah now asks Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael out, and this time God permits that to happen. It says, I will watch over you. You will also be a nation, but you will not be the inheritor of the promise, and you will be in conflict with your brother and with the other people. Now, I think the spiritual significance of this, you need to go and read in Galatians, I think Galatians 3, talking about what is the difference between the descendant of the flesh and the descendant of promise, and talking about how it is by faith that we are children of God. It is not by mere physical descendants, because Ishmael could otherwise claim the same thing, but rather it was who God, by His grace, gave to Abraham. So let's just walk through Genesis 12. So how God first calls Abraham, promises him a seed, and then now we're just going to walk through some of the events in Abraham's life. So he first stays in Egypt, and then he denies Sarai to be his wife. As he meets the king of Egypt, he's afraid that they would kill him. He says, "This is not my wife; she's my sister," which is half true, because she was his half sister. And then you have God protecting Sarai in the midst of Abraham's denial, God blessing him even through that event, and elevating Abraham among the Egyptians by showing that his favor was upon Abraham. Once again, it just shows the
where Abraham's trust was, whether it was in God or whether it was in his own devices. And then you have the separation of Lot from Abram. Once again, is Lot going to be the descendant? No. But as both Lot and Abram grow, there is conflict between them. And you see here some real interesting patterns. Abram is the one who observes this problem, and he tells the Lot, you pick where you want to go, and I'll go the other way, which would have been the opposite of what would be the cultural pattern, which is, Abram is the uncle, and he can say, I'm going here, you go the other way. But rather, he gives Lot the choice, if you will. And Lot, as we know, chooses very badly. He sees physical prosperity in the land of Sodom. The rivers are there. There's a flush. There's a plentiful region where all the gas can grow, and he goes there, and he runs into a couple of problems. The first one is the war, where the kings rise up against Sodom. Lot is taken as a slave, bounty of war. Abram, with his men, single-handedly rescues all the kings, rescues Lot, doesn't take anything, just to show that he will be blessed by God, not by the kings that he rescued. And so we saw the covenant ceremony already, but just another point on that. Let's not. So you have again the various events. So you have the covenant ceremony where the animals were cut in half. Then you have Ishmael being born, and then you have the covenant sign of circumcision, which is done later. And so both Ishmael and Abram and all of Abram's family has this covenant sign. So the covenant itself was given first, and the sign is a private sign. It is not a sign for the rest of the world. It was for himself to know that this is the God who's going to bless me who has blessed me even when I am in my old age, because it is supernaturally that I have Isaac. And then you have the destruction of Sodom. Once again, today the liberals would like to find all kinds of reasons why Sodom was destroyed. That it was, they were inhospitable, they had a bunch of different reasons, but I think the text there is very explicit. Here were the angels that God sends to Sodom, and the people of Sodom wanted to have sexual relationships with them, the men there, and God rescues Lot by these angels out of there, and then he destroys Sodom after rescuing Lot. There's one event that we skipped here, and that has to do with Abraham's conversation with God. Just before the angels are sent to Sodom, God talks to Abraham as with a friend. And it is a very interesting conversation because from Abraham's standpoint, he has a deep love for Lot and he doesn't want Lot to get destroyed. And as he is talking, he kind of almost bargains with God. 50 people, will you let Sodom survive? 40, 30, 20. And then at 10, he's like, okay, I think Lot is safe. But what he doesn't know is there's not even 10 people there. And God just shows his graciousness in engaging with Abraham during this time. And then after this, you have one more sojourn in Gerar, and again, similar to Egypt, Abraham denies Sarah again. And this is when the separation of Ishmael occurs. And then you have the testing of Abraham. Actually, that's one thing we should probably take a couple of minutes to talk about. I think this select. Oh, yes, okay. This, I have a few authors I like. One of them is Kierkegaard. He writes things that are confusing, but he wrote a book called Fear and Trembling, which has to do with this sacrifice. I think the famous words he says, Abraham, I cannot understand. Where did he get that strength to hold that sword, that knife, when his only son, the apple of his eye, after all these many years of waiting, before him. And I think that we have this again explained in Hebrews, but you have this faith of Abraham, and you see this in Romans, you see this in other New Testament texts. This is the faith that boggles our mind, as it were. You have, I need to talk about this a minute. So you have Isaac, who is now a young boy, and God calls upon Abram to sacrifice his son. Now here's a son that Abram has received after over 100 years, and now this one person upon whom his whole hope is placed, God calls, and Abram does not demur. He goes to Mount Moriah, and some believe that this is the place where the temple now is, and this is where Jesus was crucified in the mount outside of Jerusalem. So maybe there's definitely symbolism here between the sacrifice that was almost occurred, which God provides for, and then the sacrifice of the Father of His Son on the cross 2,000 years later. But what you have here is Abraham trusts God, and Hebrews would say that when Abraham was dead, as it were, physically incapable of having a son, God gave him a son. And when God now asked for a son, he believed that God would bring him his son back. He didn't know how or what, but he trusted in God because God was the one who gave him what he has, and God would provide for it. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we all face. When you go through life, I want to do things my way. And if I wanted to do this my way, I would not do what God wanted. But God, Abraham, does what passes the test, as it were. Adam and Eve, they had the fruit. They decided they wanted to do it their way. But Abraham trusts. And then this verse here is, Abraham called on the name of the Lord. Called the name of the place that the Lord would provide, as it is said, in the mount of the Lord, it would be provided.
So I think it says in Hebrews that he reasoned that God could raise him from the dead.
Yes.
And one of the most dramatic things I ever saw was there was a video done by New Tribes Missions about this guy that went from Pennsylvania, learned the language of the people, and he started teaching the scriptures to the people. And the entire village would be there to hear. And he stopped this portion of the teaching at God's command to Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. And then all the elders got together and they looked, what will we do? And so all they knew so far was that up to Genesis there. And they reasoned, and he said that overnight, like 3 or 4 of the elders came to his hut and said, he'll do it because God can raise him from the dead. And so these guys, I mean, it was just like, it blew me away just watching it. It was a reenactment, but I thought I was seeing it for the first time. It just brought me to tears just seeing the response of the people. And so anyway, but I never, we're so continuing to read. Right? And we don't stop and mull and wrestle with ourselves, but these people did. Because they didn't know what was coming next.
Once you understand who our God is and what He's able to do, and it changes the way we look at life. And I think for us, like you said, we're so familiar with the story. It's like, yeah, Abraham sacrificed his son, or was willing to.
Yeah.
And this is unprecedented. We have Abraham, and of course we have the scriptures, but here was Abraham before God and showed what trust really meant. Let me stop with this slide. So the last slide for here is, once again, bring back the familiar theme of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So even under Abram renamed to Abraham, the father of the many nations. You have Isaac, which is the child of promise, and you have Ishmael. And then Isaac will have 2 sons. One is Esau and the other Jacob. Once again, you can see there's going to be a flipping happening. We'll see this next week. Ishmael is older in one sense, although not the child of promise.
Esau is the older one, but God would place his favor on Jacob. And the question on this slide is, whose seed are you? And I think, we are not a descendant of Abraham, at least in this room. None of us are Jewish, but when we talk about how do we find favor with God, it is by God choosing us and placing us in His drafting us, as it were, into His family. We were all seed of a servant, but by God's grace we now find favor. All right, let's stop here. We'll pick up the Jacob narrative next week. Any questions? Comments? Please feel free to email. I know we're kind of rushing through this. If you have any more questions, please email and we'll talk about it. I'll have the quiz set up by end of tomorrow. I'll send you an email when it's ready. All right, let me pray. Our loving and gracious Father, we thank you, Lord, for your Son, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who was tempted as we are and yet did not sin, who gave his life that we may have life. Help us, O Father, even as we look at your hand in the life of these Old Testament saints, that you would help us to trust you, to follow you, and to learn from you with each moment that we live, whether we live in, whether we face trials or whether we face great joys, even blessings. For we know that you are with us and you will indeed provide for all our needs. In Christ's name we pray.